And with that, another season is wrapped up. What did I think? Well, this is definitely a continuation of the new era in a lot of ways, and really one of my big complaints with the new era is the fact that these seasons feel the same for a lot of it. But I'm not gonna lie, I feel like 44 was an improvement over 43. I feel like it's probably one of the better seasons of the new era, all things considered, and I did like it at points, though there were definitely some low points along the way that we'll get into in a moment. But as usual with these reviews, I like to break them down to 4 sections, those being the cast, production, editing, presentation, and gameplay. But with that out of the way, let's get right into it. So first up, we got the cast, and I feel like all things considered, this cast is probably a step down from other New Era seasons, although there are a couple big standouts here. I mean, if we're going through the boot order, first we got Bruce, who I definitely felt bad for. I mean, I know people noticed from the promo that he was the one to get injured, and I didn't really factor that into my preseason, the fact that he could be medevac, even though I was aware about that. Although we will be getting him again on 45, so let's go. Next up we have Maddie, who largely went how I expected her to. I felt like she was going to play a bit too hard too fast, and while I have issues with the way she played during that round, like her not splitting the vote and not getting Jamie to vote, I feel like she definitely was one of the better first boots, simply for the fact that she did get the numbers on her side and that she was simply idled out of the game, so I feel like that was a factor in my view. Then we have Helen, who again I do feel bad for, especially with the way she reacted on her way out, and I was actually kind of worried that this could happen to her in the preseason, where even though I felt like she had a lot of potential, I didn't know that she had this potential to be seen as an under the radar threat and be taken up because of that. So on the whole, I feel pretty bad for Helen. Next up we have Claire, who I feel like largely disappointed, all things considered. Now I didn't have her as my winner pick, but I felt like she would have done a bit better than this, but as it is, I mean, she never really was that well positioned. Then we have Sarah, who I definitely took a big gamble on by putting her high on my preseason ranking, and while she didn't quite pan out the way that I thought she would, I still think there's quite a bit of potential in her. And then we have Matthew from Ratu, the last pre-merge boot, and my winner pick for the season. And not gonna lie, I feel like he was playing the way I thought he would, and he was one of the bigger characters from the pre-merge, except for the fact that he decided it'd be a great idea to climb a rock, hurt his shoulder, and then quit the game because of that. I guess he wasn't quite like Tyson after all. And then we get to the mergatory where we have Josh, who again was definitely a step down from what I thought he was going to be, but obviously once the season started, I feel like it was pretty clear that he was pretty out of it socially, to where he was kind of coming off as a bit sketchy, and I feel like he mainly got to the merge due to his physical strength, which I was a bit disappointed as a factor, but on the whole, pretty mediocre player. Then we have Matt, who definitely landed right around the middle of the pack, and I think that kind of fits considering how I felt about him preseason. I felt like he could have gone all over the place, so with him being mid-game boot, I feel like that kind of fits for him. Then we have Brandon, who again was a bit of a disappointment for me. I feel like he would have been more like a Danny, but as it is, he was largely just a big shield for a lot of people throughout the game, and the fact that he never survives a round without immunity is a bit funny there. Then we have Kane, who I said in preseason that he was probably going to be my rooting interest, and to a degree, he was probably one of the best case scenarios for his archetype, but I'm not going to lie, I feel like he was kind of under-edited on the show. I feel like he was a bit of a dud on the show at least, but I'm so glad that he made a deep run, and from what we heard from the jury afterwards, he actually was pretty well respected, so on the whole, I'm proud of Kane. Then we have Franny, who largely panned out how I expected her to. Now yes, I didn't quite anticipate her having a showmance per se, but I felt like she was going to be a bit on the nerdier side, and by the end she actually proved to be a bit of a comp beast and pretty well respected because of that, so I felt like it would have been interesting to see how she would have done had she gone to the end, as I felt like that was a big concern that I had with her in the preseason, but on the whole I feel like she was pretty interesting. Then we have Danny, who was pretty different from what he came off in the preseason, where he talked so much about compassion and how he's going to be kind and stuff, only for him to be sort of a villain by the end of it. And I thought he was pretty entertaining. He had his moments here and there, but never someone that I thought was going to win. Then we have Jamie, who was another big surprise, not so much in the sense of how she did, as I feel like she placed kind of how I would expect someone like her to do, but the fact that she was dunked on so much in the edit for her being like ridiculous and thinking she's the MVP, and her coming off as paranoid in the first round even though she needed her shot in the dark. and the fact that she is the first successful shot in the dark play is pretty funny there, but again, she was definitely funny at points as well. Then we have Lauren, who, I'm not gonna lie, was kind of boring for a lot of it. I feel like she was just kind of there in the edit for most of it, until the end when she started to get her content about her being a single mom and stuff, but as I explained in my power rankings, I felt like that was never enough to make her a winner in my eyes. So again, I feel like she was just kind of there. Then we have Carson, who was a bit different from how I expected as well. Not so much in the way that he played, but in how successful he was, where I feel like a big concern for me was the fact that he was going to like either flame out or sort of be like this big threat around like the final 8, final 7 round. But I feel like he played pretty well, all things considered. He was able to build genuine bonds with people and skate his way deeper into the game than he probably should have, until the point where he was put into fire and lost, which I felt like was pretty well forecast in the edit. But as it is, I feel like Carson was definitely a big surprise for me. Then we have Carolyn, who obviously is one of the biggest characters from this season, and I love Carolyn. I felt like she was a very fun presence on the season, and I feel like she panned out the way I thought she would, where I know people were saying that she was going to be this early boot, but I felt like she always had a deep run in her. I felt like her self-awareness and her game knowledge is going to play a big factor in her making it deep into the game, and even at the end, I feel like I kind of nailed it as well, where I felt like she was going to have troubles for perception with being seen as this emotional player. Now, I am a bit surprised she didn't get any votes at Final Tribal, considering the content that she got with her relationship with Franny. However, I still feel like she was a competent player and played a good game, all things considered. Then we have the runner-up in Heidi, who, again, was kind of there in the edit for a lot of the season. I know a lot of people dunk on her game, and I have plenty of issues with it myself, but at the end of the day, I mean, she's not the worst player in the world. I feel like of the runners-up in the new era, she's probably one of the better ones, or at least compared to the likes of like Romeo, Xander, or Owen from 43. But as a character, I found her just kind of okay. And then we have the winner in Jam Jam, and I feel like Jam Jam was a pretty fun character, sort of like what I expected from him in the preseason. And the fact that he is the winner here is pretty satisfying as well. He's the first Puerto Rican to win the show, which is pretty exciting there. And I think from a gameplay perspective, I mean, we'll talk about him as a player in a moment, but I feel like he was a pretty satisfying winner from a gameplay perspective, as well as an entertainment perspective. So on the whole, I feel like you definitely have a couple standout characters like Jam Jam, Carolyn, Danny, and kind of Carson. However, I feel like the rest of the cast is definitely okay. I mean, not the worst cast in the world, but I feel like there were definitely a couple of less notable players. That kind of makes this cast pretty inconsistent, but at the end of the day, I don't have too many complaints with the cast. Next up, let's talk about production, which I know is going to generate the most complaints, and I have my fair share of complaints as well, but they did make a number of improvements that I think sort of level it out, but we'll still talk about them as we go along. So first up, I feel like the biggest overall improvement is the return of the regular idols. I mean, I feel like the Beware advantage had sort of run its course by this point, so I feel like it was about time to bring back the regular idols, and I think they had a pretty notable impact on the gameplay, where I feel like for the first time in a while, idols were playing a significant factor over the course of the season, where I feel like on 41 through 43, idols were only being used like towards like the end game, and I feel like they weren't really playing factor much in the pre-merge, but I feel like here it's sort of like the opposite, where it's like now we're having idols being played a lot during the pre-merge. There's a lot of talk about people just finding idols. Like, it definitely felt like a breath of fresh air in terms of people like finding and playing idols, which I think on the whole is a net benefit in the sense that it made the season feel more different from the other New Era seasons, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a general complaint with the New Era. And I guess the other main thing to talk about is the introduction of a trade swap. I know, it sounds crazy, right? Now, I will admit I was a bit underwhelmed that it was only one person swapping, and yes, while they did give them idols, I feel like it also sort of made the gameplay probably not as interesting as it probably would have been. I would have preferred if we had like a regular swap where we're seeing all these new relationships being formed, but instead we just have like one person going over, and like them having an idol is the main thing that's making things interesting, as I feel like otherwise it would have made the votes pretty boring, but as it is, they made them good, although I wish in the future they would just go back to the regular old trade swap. So I think in terms of those things, you can definitely point to positives that production has been doing. However, I still think there are still plenty of issues to take with here. Where first up, I think the birdcage as a twist was pretty underwhelming, where I knew coming in that it was definitely something with a lot of potential to do well, in the sense that it would essentially be a public idol. I thought it was going to be just this idol hanging around for anyone to take, and the moment someone took it, then people would know that it'd be taken. But instead, it just felt like this normal advantage. It was sort of tucked away from camp, and I feel like there weren't a ton of consequences for people opening the cage per se, and I felt like that led to it being a bit underwhelming in my view, although I kind of understand why they needed it to be that way. Like, they wanted there to be at least some reason for people to go out looking for it, give us some content of people looking for it. And yes, there were some fun things like Carolyn like putting those X in order to make people think that it was still there. You have like Danny like luring Matt into finding the fake idol. Like, I think that was a bit interesting. But again, on the whole, I found that a bit underwhelming from that end. And really the fact that production was planting a fake idol is another knock, in the sense that I don't think production should be planting fake idols. I think the players should be solely responsible for that. I feel like it's a legitimate form of strategy. And I feel like for production to put in fake idols, it's a thing that can undermine trust in production moving forward, that you're basically lying to these players. Although, to be fair, like, they didn't like provide a clue or anything, but still, I feel like this is something that production should largely stay out of. And speaking of production getting in the way of the gameplay, you have some less than desirable twists. Where first up, you have that first visit to the summit in episode 1, where the players are forced to drop in the bag, which contains a 66% chance of them losing their vote at least one tribal, which I think right away is a bit too much. I feel like the fact that players are basically forced to potentially lose their vote right out of the gate through no decision of their own is not very fun. Or at least in previous seasons, like, the players could choose to take a risk, whereas here you're literally forcing them to gamble their vote away right out of the gate for no real reason. And you also have the split tribal that happened right after the Earn the Merge twist, which completely undercuts that message, and I felt like completely screws over Matt in a position where he didn't need to be screwed over, and I felt like it also really harmed the pacing of the season. Although I will say the flip side to that is that at least it made it so that the rounds afterwards were normal rounds, but I still would have preferred if they had at least one normal round after the Earn the Merge, especially if they're going to be insisting on this terminology in the future. Now, we also did get some new advantages here, such as the inheritance advantage, which seems interesting on paper, although I could imagine it easily being broken, particularly if she played it during an advantage get-in situation, where all of a sudden she now has 3 idols, which would have been insane there. But Sarah's voted out before it could ever be played, so much for that. And then you also have the control of vote advantage, which also seems interesting on paper. However, I feel like the way the tribes broke down at that split tribal made it so that it wasn't as effective, as at the end of the day, the vote was always going to be Matt there. But still, it could be interesting to see how it plays out on a future season, particularly in a non-split tribal format. And no discussion of production would be complete without the On Fire podcast with Jeff Probst, which I tuned into each week alongside Survivor Know-It-Alls. And for the most part, it was okay. It was pretty much what you would expect out of Jeff starting a podcast about Survivor. Although we did get some insight into what he thinks of the new era, which, if you don't like the new era, then I got some bad news for you.
Jeff, you aren't listening to the fans. You just do whatever you want. The players aren't playing Survivor anymore. They're getting played by Survivor. Who is that fun for?
All right, Hillary. I am curious why you watch when Survivor so clearly annoys you. We don't want to ruin your show. I say it's evolution or experimentation. But if the show died, and I don't want it to, but if it died because of me, I'd rather it died because he went too far. He lost his mind.
But all in all, I am glad I at least tuned into it just to see like what Jeff is thinking these days. So on the whole, I still have issues with production, particularly in this new era. However, they still made some minor improvements that made the experience a little bit better. But still, I wish they would make some bigger changes. And now we get to everyone's favorite subject, the editing, which was obviously different from that of 43 in a number of ways. I feel like for one, it was definitely more telegraphed what was going to happen during the season, given the eventual outcome. I mean, I'm not exactly Nostradamus for saying that the Tika 3 were going to steamroll and one of them was going to win. It seems like a lot of people were able to pick up on that, and I think that's reflected in the edit, where it was so clear that they were the main characters during the season, to where it felt like no other scenario could happen. Which is funny considering that Jeff talks about how this was one of their favorite seasons, that it was going to be crazy and stuff. And I feel like looking back, it's pretty clear that the Tika 3 dominating is a big reason why. It led to the season feeling fun, that these big characters were going to be the ones that ran the day. And while that leads to a more coherent and satisfying storyline than that of 43, it was obviously a more predictable one. And even between the Tika 3, I felt like you could count out Carson from pretty early on, which led to between Carolyn and Jam Jam. And I know that I had Carolyn more consistently high on my power rankings throughout the entire season, but I feel like by the end, Jam Jam clearly edged her out in the edit, to where it made sense why he was the winner. And I felt like Jam Jam had a pretty notable winner's edit here, where right out the bat in the premiere, he gets a Matt Chad, which makes us 4 for 4 in the new era in terms of getting a Matt Chad, which is pretty funny there. But even beyond that, he talks about how he has a different perspective due to being from Puerto Rico, and after Bruce's medevac, he talks about how they're going to win the game for Tika. And I feel like moving forward, he continues to get a consistent presence, although not the most notable character there, and even gets some negativity later on in the pre-merge where he's shown fighting with Carolyn after the whole Sarah stuff, which isn't great, but then I feel like he rebounds pretty stolidly from that. And I feel like from the merge on, he pretty much becomes the main character of the season, where he narrates a lot of what's happening in the game. He talks about how everyone that throws name down ends up going home themselves. He gets consistent strategic content working alongside Carson. He also gets plenty of personal content talking about his background, talking about his personal relationship with Carolyn and Carson, talking about how the Tika 3 have been working together. He even gets plenty of camp scenes, which highlights his social game. I feel like by the end of it, it became pretty clear that Jam was going to win, even though Carolyn was still getting a pretty solid edit during a lot of it. So I feel like by the end, Jam has a pretty solid winner's edit that made it pretty clear that he was going to win. And I also think that's reflected in the power ranking, where I feel like week over week, he was in the top half for a lot of it. And literally in the post-merge, he was pretty much in the top 2 during the second half of that season, and he was the pretty clear number 1 by the end of it. So at the end of the day, I feel like Jam's edit was pretty well established to be that of a winner. But if we are looking at other aspects of the edit, I do like how they are continuing in this trend of being more goofy. You can tell that this was supposed to be like a fun season, given that we had like characters like Danny and Jamie getting pretty negative edits, albeit comical ones, that definitely led to the season having a lighter vibe compared to the likes of 41 and 42. And I feel like now that we are getting more comfortable in the new era, that they are trying to weave back in some of these elements that were being pushed aside earlier on in favor of being more sentimental and talking about the journey. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the season did a better job at explaining the game dynamics compared to 43, where I feel like in 43 things were just happening without much explanation. I feel like the gameplay from the season was better explained in the edit compared to 43. Although even then, I feel like there was a number of things that were left out of the edit that'll probably come out more in exit interviews. Namely the Matthew and King relationship, also the whole Jamie situation with her playing her shot in the dark. I feel like that was less than ideal. And I think there were just things that were happening off camera that I feel like would have been better if they were shown on the show. But with the show moving towards 90 minutes, starting with Survivor 45, I'm kind of hoping that they'll be able to use this extra time to better explain their relationships and the game dynamics, so that we have a better understanding of what's happening in the game. But on the whole, I feel like the editing from the season was kind of an improvement from 43 in the sense of telling a compelling storyline, even though at the end of the day, it was a bit more predictable. And finally, let's talk a bit about the gameplay from this season, which again feels a bit samey compared to other New Era seasons, but does have some improvements in some regards. I think the shift back to regular idols had a pretty immediate impact with that Maddie tribal, where yes, there was a lot of craziness going on with the Shot in the Darks being played, but I think the idol also played a factor into that, which made it a bit explosive and a bit entertaining. I also think Matthew was a very innovative player and a very fun presence during the pre-merge, where he had a lot of interesting ideas, such as using a shot in the dark at the first tribal to hide his allegiance. I think that was very creative there. but his bigger move is creating a fake idol, planting it, luring someone to find it, and then using that information to build a game relationship with them. I think that's also very creative, and I think in general Matthew is one of the funner game players from the season, and it's just a shame that he left as early as he did, but definitely a highlight during the pre-merge there. However, outside of that, a lot of the pre-merge votes were pretty underwhelming in my view, where I felt like we were just losing people that weren't that big presences on the show. And I know there's this big discussion now about how the new era format disfavors women, particularly due to this emphasis on challenge strength, and I might make a video about this in the future, but I do think it's a bit underwhelming to see like the first pre-merge in Survivor history where all the vote outs are women, which is a bit unfortunate of a stat there, where yes, some of it was due to wonky circumstances like the Maddie tribal with the idol and the Sarah tribal with Josh being handed an idol, but still, I do think there's some credence to this idea that the new era format is a bit bland and a bit disadvantageous towards female players, and while the post-merge relied a bit too much on original tribal lines, I do think it led to a pretty interesting storyline in terms of the Tika 3 navigating the middle, and I think the way they navigated the middle was somewhat interesting, where you had that Brandon tribal where they're essentially able to play the middle by casting their votes for Franny, even knowing that Danny was going to play an idol for her, just to placate both sides there in order to recognize that Danny was making this big move while coming off to the Ratus as being on their side. So I found that pretty interesting. And I think the end game itself was also somewhat interesting. The fact that the Tika 3 decided to take each other all the way to the final four, despite there being some distrust towards the end, particularly with their threat level. And we obviously see Carson losing in fire after Heidi put herself in it, which is pretty interesting as well. That leads to this final three of Carolyn, Heidi, and Jam Jam. And I think from a gameplay perspective, this is probably the most well-rounded final three, where I feel like on 41, 42, 43, there was obviously that one player that was pretty much a dud on the season. You have Xander from 41, Romeo from 42, and Owen from 43. And I feel like the best player of that bunch is better than the best player from the other new era final threes, where I feel like Jam Jam is easily number one on the winner ranking from the new era. And if we are talking about Jam Jam as a winner, I think he played a pretty solid game where he was in the majority for most of the game, and I feel like he was working alongside Carson for a lot of that post-merge. I know a lot of people see Carson as the more outwardly strategic player, and I probably would have given Carson more credit had he gone to the end. However, I still think Jam Jam was working right alongside them. I felt like they were coming up with plans together to dominate the game and to play the middle in that post-merge. Now, Jam Jam was technically in danger in more points compared to Carson. However, I think those were due to things outside of Jam Jam's control, where obviously at the swap, he's in a bad spot due to Josh coming over, having an idol, and using that to sway over Carolyn to voting out Sarah. I think that's not ideal for his game. But again, a lot of that was perpetuated by Josh being handed an idol after that swap, where I feel like if it wasn't for that, Josh would have been the easy boot and Jam Jam would have continued to be in a good position. But even then, after Jam Jam loses Sarah, Josh approaches Jam Jam about working together, making Josh a swing vote, and I think Josh probably would have sided with Jam Jam had they gone back to tribal, but even then, Jam Jam and Carolyn are able to get back together to where they're essentially now the majority again, would have taken out Josh had they gone to that tribal. And then post-merge, I mean, yes, he is technically part of that split vote plan. However, Josh was a pretty clear target then, and a lot of that was to split the vote in case of an idol, even though the idol was fake. So I think that's a big factor there. He obviously gets a very bad split during that split tribal, but again, the fact that he's able to stay over Matt in that spot is pretty good there. Although to be fair, I mean, some of that could be due to perception, given that the Tikas were coming off as the weaker force compared to the Sokas. So I guess you could say that Brandon and the Ratus were voting out Matt in order to weaken the Sokas, who they saw as the bigger threat at that point. But still, I feel like Jam Jam played that round pretty well. But then from that point on, they're essentially able to dominate the game. They're able to dominate alongside Carson to ride the middle and take out the big players from both of the sides until they're down to the final five. And at that point, I think Jam Jam's in the best spot to get to the end, where Carson and Carolyn are seen as these bigger threats, and there's this bigger emphasis on taking them out. while Jan Jam is pretty much locked to get to the end, and even at the point where Heidi is choosing to keep Jan Jam in the game over Carson, I think says a lot about Jan Jam's threat management and his social game, to where he easily wins at the end in a 7-1 vote, which, as a side note, the fact that we got another 7-1 vote is pretty insane there. I think it adds to this idea that all these new era seasons kind of feel the same, but whatever. But I feel like Jan Jam easily played the best winning game out of anyone from the new era so far, and I feel like I would have voted for Jan Jam at the end given this final 3. And while I would have probably given Carson more credit had they gone to the end together, I still feel like Jan Jam played a very solid winning game, and on the whole is a satisfying winner from a gameplay perspective. So in a lot of ways, the gameplay from this season feels kind of samey in terms of a mostly boring pre-merge from a vote basis, although there was some intrigue in terms of the way Matthew was playing and with the way the idols were shaking out. And the post-merge definitely had some interesting gameplay, definitely solid gameplay from Jan Jam, Carson, and Carolyn, although the tribal lines did play a factor more than I would have liked, considering the fact that we had a swap. But on the whole, I don't have too many complaints with the gameplay from this season, aside from it feeling kinda like the same as usual. So all in all, I did enjoy Survivor 44. I feel like it has a lot of the same trappings as other new era seasons, and I can definitely understand people saying that all of these new era seasons kind of feel the same, even though they're trying out all these new things. But at the end of the day, I still feel like it's one of the better new era seasons, and definitely led to a satisfying story and outcome for the season. But there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now moving forward, I'm probably going to be making more general Survivor content as we enter the summer months and in the lead up to Big Brother 25, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which you can join by clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.